James cleverly joins me in the studio. Sorry, James, I described you as the shadow foreign... I always get this confused. You were shadow foreign secretary for a long time. Then you became Home Secretary, so you're now shadow Home Secretary. So I apologise.
That's right.
Speaking earlier.
I don't mind.
Can we talk, first of all, before we get into all of the leadership stuff, I just want to put something to you, because Tories have obviously been banging on about this smoking ban and going, oh, you know, what are Labour doing? They're so authoritarian, trying to ban smoking and vaping outdoors. You did vote for the Tobacco and Vapes Bill.
Yeah.
So the argument is that the Tories laid the foundation for these sorts of draconian measures.
I don't buy into that at all. Look, there is a massive difference between taking action to prevent young people starting a habit that we all know is deeply unhealthy, very, very, very unhealthy. That's one thing. And it's a completely different thing saying to adults who already smoke, and whilst I used to smoke, I don't smoke anymore, and saying to them, oh, actually, what we're going to do is nibble away at your freedoms. I think the Labour Party shows cowardice on their part, because they're saying, oh, you can't smoke indoors, and now you can't smoke outdoors, but you can definitely still smoke. And they should just be more honest about it.
I know, but people might think that the Tories laid the foundations for this nanny statism, and, you know, we had George Osborne suggesting sort of pasty and sugar taxes. We had a Conservative government obviously locking us down for months on end. We've had free money in the form of furlough. It's like all of this sort of like big state initiative sort of has started over the last... It started with Blair, admittedly, but it was continued over 14 years by the Conservatives, and now you're complaining that he's being authoritarian.
No, Camilla, when something of the magnitude of COVID happens, you have to act in a different way. So Churchill, during the war, had to put in place loads of things like rationing, curfews, a whole load of limitations, which you don't do in normal circumstances, but you do because of the event. That's what we had to do with COVID. That's why we made decisions during that uniquely difficult period of time that we would not do normally. And I think it was Andrew who said about taxation, for example. Yeah. Conservatives put up taxes when we have to. Labour put up taxes whenever they can get away with it. It's the same with these kind of things. We take actions like this, not because we enjoy it, because we really don't, but because there are times when you have to take action.
Don't we now look back on the lockdowns and regret some of the actions that were taken? Not only were they deeply regrettable for people's civil liberties and mental health, but also economically catastrophic.
So hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Hang on, you say hindsight. People like me on The Telegraph were warning at the time that some of the measures that you were taking were disastrous.
Yeah, but there were arguments on that side.
It wasn't hindsight. Loads of people were saying, hang on, you're locking down far too fast and too quickly, and you're continuing it for too long.
Loads of people were saying that. Loads of people were saying the opposite. The choice presented to government ministers was how to balance the respective pressures. In hindsight, and look, I'm very, very conscious that there were plenty of people who were worried about that at the time, and you know, you being one of them. But the government had to make a series of very difficult decisions at the time. Okay. We have now learned from that, and I'm sure if there were ever a circumstance like this, we would do things very, very, very differently.
All right, so we can blame lockdown and some of those measures on, obviously, the unprecedented circumstances of COVID. We can blame, perhaps, this historically high tax burden on the aftermath of COVID and the war in Ukraine and all the rest of it. What can we blame on the Conservatives failing to honour successive governments' pledges on legal migration? What can we blame that on?
Well, when I was Home Secretary, I brought migration down.
Well, he didn't have much choice. I mean, it was historically beyond the realms of even David Cameron's tens of thousands.
So, look, I'm putting myself forward to be the leader of the Conservative Party and work towards being Prime Minister. The point that I am making is that you can do one of two things in politics. You can point to a problem and shout, or you can deal with a problem. Okay. When it was my responsibility to deal with this problem, I dealt with the problem. I got the Rwanda legislation through the House of Commons. I negotiated with the Treasury and Department for Education, Department of Health to change the visa regime, which has seen something like a 40% reduction in the visas that were most problematic. That is projected to reduce net migration by 100,000.
Which Labour will now reap the benefits of because of Rishi Sunak's quite preposterous decision to call an early election.
But the point is that the job that I was tasked with doing, I did. Didn't moan about it, didn't groan about it, rolled up my sleeves, got on with it.
OK, that's fine when you were Home Secretary, but when you were Cabinet members and an MP and involved in the management of the Conservative Party, you could see legal migration, forget illegal migration and stopping the votes, let's just look at legal migration, going up and up and up. You could see successive manifesto pledges broken by the Conservatives. We had David Cameron talking about tens of thousands. We had Theresa May talking about tens of thousands. We had your old mate Boris Johnson not really that bothered about immigration, which might have been a problem and might have been one of the reasons for his demise. Successive Conservative governments have broken their promise to the British public on immigration. So it's all very well saying that at the nth hour when you came in, you tried to do something about it. Shouldn't have got that high in the first place.
Camilla, I didn't try to do something about it. Lots of people have tried to do something about it. I actually did something about it.
So if you were Tory leader, what would legal migration be? Would you cap it, and what would you cap it at, and how would you cap it?
So this is a really, really interesting, a really important question. Because the easiest thing for me to do was say, I would cap it at 100,000. But the point is, the British people at the moment don't trust us because we've talked tough on immigration.
Well, they would trust you if you did what you said.
Well, this is the point I'm making. Yeah. So it's not about what you say; it's about what you do. And when I was responsible for this, it is possible to do.
Because you were Home Secretary.
Can you cap? I was responsible.
Because we hear from lots of people, particularly on the left, it's impossible. Healthcare will collapse, so will hospitality. We've had Reform talk about net zero immigration, which might
rode back on it almost immediately.
Right, so that might not be realistic. You tell me, you're a former Home Secretary. Is it possible, legally, practically and logistically, to cap legal migration at 100,000?
Well, the figure is entirely dependent on the needs of the country. And one of the reasons why I'm saying we need to measure our wealth as a nation fundamentally differently. At the moment, we measure overall GDP. And we should be measuring GDP per person, how wealthy we are per person. So, for example, India has a much higher total GDP than Switzerland. But the Swiss are individually much wealthier than Indians. So what we need to do is we need to start by measuring the right thing. That will then help us understand how much migration we need, because there will be times when you need to turn it up and times when you need to turn it down.
And different sectors may have different needs at different times.
So, but the point I'm making with regard to the Conservative Party's history with talking about migration is, as I say, I am happy to take responsibility for the time that I was responsible for it. And when I personally was responsible for it, we brought the figures down massively. So I'm very proud of my record, and if I led the party, it will be that focus on delivery rather than rhetoric that will be the hallmark of my time as leader.
All Tories talk a good game on low taxes. If you were Tory leader, which tax would you cut first?
Well, I would prioritise work-related taxes. I think we need to get back into the habit of rewarding work. I am not going to go into detailed tax proposals.
But do you fancy unfreezing those tax bands that have fiscally dragged a lot of middle earners into high income tax thresholds?
Yeah, look, and the taxes that were created for the super wealthy now affect a whole load of people, like inheritance tax, those tax bands. So what we need to do is overall, as I say, I'm not going to go line by line at this stage.
Would you look at things like, for instance, because it would be very attractive to Tory voters, wouldn't it, if you said that you were looking to look at perhaps scrapping or reducing inheritance tax?
Well, I know, tempting as it will be during an election campaign, I am not going to make specific tax commitments. But the broad point, and I've said this publicly, if you want to understand, Milton Friedman made this point, if you want to understand how much your government is taxing you, look at how much your government is spending. Because all public spending ultimately gets paid for by the taxpayer, either through direct taxation or through inflation or through borrowing. So we need to reduce our spending. Now, the one area I think we need to spend more on is defence. And I'm committed to 3% of GDP in defence. But Ian is absolutely right. Our welfare bill has run out of control. We need to get that back down. We need to get people in work rather than on benefits. We need to make sure we give people that liberating opportunity to earn for themselves rather than live on government
Time
money.
is fast running out, but I just wanted to ask you about one more interview that's in the Sunday Telegraph with Andy Cook, who is the Chief Inspector of the Constabulary. He's the person who oversees the police force. And he basically used the word dysfunctional to describe our police forces in this country. We've obviously had the whole debate about two-tier policing, which I know you commented on throughout the riots. I mean, what needs to happen to the police force? Is the police force broken?
Well, look, I was on the Metropolitan Police Authority when I first got elected. I was responsible for kicking corrupt police officers out the Met and indeed sending some of them to prison. So I've been looking at the governance of policing since I started in politics. We need to go back to first principles. The police need to stop being scared of being accused of politicising their decisions. They need to police completely fairly, whether you're black, white, gay, straight, whatever. Everyone gets policed the same.
Pro-Palestinian,
everyone gets policed the same. And that is the cornerstone of confidence in British policing. We also need to understand that they need to focus on the crimes that affect people's everyday lives. When I was Home Secretary, I made it absolutely clear they were to pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry. They were to crack down on shoplifting. This idea there was a £200 limit, get rid of that, because if you don't crack down on the small crimes, those criminals get more and more severe, and then you have a real problem. So
would you be looking to build more prison places? Because obviously if you're going to have a crackdown and a more zero-tolerance approach, then you're going to have more people in prisons and the prisons are full.
Well, the simple fact of it is we want to send fewer people to prison by having fewer people committing crimes.
Yeah.
So cracking down on the criminal behaviour, catching people early when they're doing the kind of crimes that you would never put people to prison for.
Would you put people in prison, by the way, for putting things on Facebook, like the 54-year-old woman?
So this is getting ridiculous. This is getting ridiculous.
15 months she got. I mean, is that, really briefly, was that a mistake in sentencing? 15 months. It was an albeit terrible Facebook post. It was very disparaging about Muslims and suggesting, inciting violence against a mosque. But as far as I could tell, she didn't have any previous convictions. She's in prison for 15 months.
So incitement is a serious issue, but this overall trend that we're seeing from the Labour government of criminalising voices they just don't like, we have got to be very, very, very careful about that. I'm deeply uncomfortable with that. And
finally, Ian Duncan-Smith was in the studio just earlier. I know you heard the interview. He's saying that China is the biggest threat that Britain faces. Do you agree with him?
China is the biggest threat, but also the biggest opportunity. It is the most significant emerging power. When I was Foreign Secretary, traditionally you have a Mansion House speech where you talk about all kinds of things going on around the world. When I was Foreign Secretary, I dedicated the whole speech to our relationship with China.
I know, but if you're seeing China always as an opportunity for investment, then what happens is...
No, that's not what I said. Yeah, that is not what I said.
Favourable, but this is the trouble, and it kind of, George Osborne and David Cameron came unstuck here, didn't they?
And that's not what I'm saying.
It's this idea that, of course, we want Chinese investment if it's valuable to the City of London, for instance. And equally, it's great for universities to have Chinese students propping up fees. They're paying 30 grand. A child here is paying 9 grand. But then you get stories like we've read this morning that you get Chinese officials interfering in what we teach in our schools.
That's not what I was saying. That's not what I said in the speech. In the speech, I said, you cannot pretend China away. You cannot pretend China is not a huge global economic power. But we've also got to make sure that if there is ever a conflict between defending our interests and gaining business from China, we always defend our interests. I also made the point that to defend ourselves properly against Chinese influence, we need to build alliances around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific and Asia parts of the world, and also that we make sure we engage with China directly, which is why I flew to China. And when I spoke face-to-face with the Chinese foreign minister, my opposite number, I demanded that he stopped sanctioning Ian Duncan-Smith and Nusgani and Tom Tugendhat and others.
Did he agree with that?
No, they didn't. But I looked him in the eye and made it absolutely clear that their behaviour was unacceptable.
OK. James Cleverly, good luck this week, because it's the first vote on Wednesday, I believe,
first
and then
vote on Wednesday,
another vote after that. So good luck with the start of the new school term, so to speak, and indeed the Tory leadership race. And thank you for coming into GBNews. Lovely to speak to you. Lucy Powell joins me now. She's the leader of the House of Commons and the MP for Manchester Central. Lovely to see you this morning, Minister. Thank you. Now, we apparently have a £22 billion black hole in our finances. Britain's so broken that Sir Keir Starmer warned last week that things can only get worse. And yet the government's priority right now is banning smoking and vaping outdoors.
Well, it's not our only priority right now at all. We've got a packed agenda of things we want to change, things that the country wants to change, things that we're voted for at the election, which involve raising people's living standards, getting that much needed growth back in the economy, not growth just for its sake, but growth that can support the living standards of ordinary people right across the country, getting those NHS waiting lists down, tackling crime, illegal migration, making sure that opportunity for our young people and getting energy bills lower in the longer term as well. And these are all our priorities.
I know, but how does this possibly promote growth when it only threatens to close down pubs?
Well, I would not accept that premise. Look, what we've got here is a consensus, really, that's built over recent times that we want to aspire to get to a position where we've got a smoke-free nation. And that's why the previous Conservative government brought forward a bill to progressively increase the age by which people could buy cigarettes, a bill that we are taking forward that will also tackle the scourge of vapes for young people that are now turning to vapes. And there's a lot of unknowns there about the health impacts, because smoking is a real killer. It kills 80,000 people a year.
But vaping gets people off cigarettes, doesn't it?
Sorry?
Vaping gets people off cigarettes, doesn't it? If you're an adult vaping in a pub garden, you're trying to ban vaping outside as well as smoking. So you're not seeing its value as a cessation device.
It can get people off cigarettes, but what we're seeing is a real explosion of young people taking up vaping. They're not taking up smoking, they're taking up vaping. And that has wide implications possibly for their health and other things. So we're taking forward the previous government's bill, and we want that broad consensus, that intention about how we reduce smoking over time, something that we can all work together. And what I would reassure you and hospitality businesses about is that any such measures, should they come forward, we will work closely with business, with licensing authorities and others about the timescale of their implementation and how they would be operationalised. And we will do that in partnership and in consultation. This won't be a case of just imposing things on businesses that are damaging. And the other thing I would say is that actually many of these same arguments were made about ending smoking inside pubs and restaurants. And actually what we saw after that was an increase in people going to pubs and restaurants, because many non-smokers do find being close by to people smoking something that they don't like. And
I know, but I mean,
it's not very nice.
It's a bit different when you're outside, but let's move on, because you could also make the argument that obesity is a bigger problem for the NHS. Why not ban Mars bars? But let's move on to pensioners. Why has the Labour Party decided to prioritise giving money to public sector workers when we have a report by the Taxpayers Alliance this morning suggesting that public sector workers have actually received inflation-busting pay rises since 2010, if you take into account their very generous pensions? Why have you decided to prioritise them over actual pensioners? Is it because trade unions give so much money to the Labour Party?
Not at all. What we have inherited, as you say, is a very challenging economic situation, much worse than we thought, much worse than the Office for Budget Responsibility thought. Huge overspending in areas like the asylum bill, which has been overspent by nearly £7 billion, and other areas of overspend as well. Lots of commitments made by the previous government for which there was no money available to actually commit, and public sector pay awards that were being recommended by independent pay bodies sitting on the desks of ministers that in the previous government before the election, knowing that they were going to have to honour those, but without knowing where the money was coming from and setting nothing aside, and having spent all of the government's reserves. So we are honouring those those pay awards that have been independently recognised, but we've had to find in-year savings for this year, which is why we've had to take the very difficult decision to means test the winter fuel payment. Yeah.
OK. We're assuming taxes are going to go up, despite repeated assurances by Rachel Reeves and others throughout the entire election campaign that all of your plans were fully costed and that there would be no need to put taxes up. So are we ruling out tax cuts, tax rises? What are we saying today, Minister? about tax?
Well, we have been very clear that we won't be raising income tax, national insurance, and VAT. That's a commitment.
So which ones will you be raising?
Which ones were given before the election and through the election. And all our policies and all our plans that we put in our manifesto that we got elected on with a huge mandate to deliver, all of those policies are
which
and
taxes
remain
will go up
fully
then?
Fully costed. But what we've found is that there is no reserves left. In effect, there's no money left. There is higher
which
borrowing
taxes
in
will go up?
Current financial year than we thought. So we've got to make the sums add up, because if we don't
which taxes are going to go up?
I think this is a really important point to make. I'm not going to speculate about what's in or not in the budget. I don't know anyway, and I wouldn't be on your programme speculating about it.
You need to give us an idea. It's our hard-earned cash.
But what I will say is the biggest impact on people's living standards, on their disposable incomes, on their real incomes, is when the economy crashes, is when there's a run on the pound, when interest rates go up, because the sums don't add up and the markets lose confidence. And that's the situation that we were facing when we first got elected. So that's why economic stability and making the sums add up is so important to every single person watching your show's living standards. And that's why that's got to be our first priority. So unfortunately, we've been left with a dire situation that we've got to sort out. But over time, our commitment is to improve everybody's living standards.
OK. But what do you think the Prime Minister finds unsettling about a portrait of Margaret Thatcher?
Well, I don't know anything about that situation. But look, there are portraits of every Prime Minister in Downing Streets, and they will always remain so. And it's up to people who live and work there to decide what artwork is where, in which rooms.
Well, that's the words that his spokesman has used to describe his feelings about Margaret Thatcher. Do you find Margaret Thatcher unsettling? Perhaps it's the idea of a female Prime Minister. Is it the idea of a female leader that the leader of the Labour Party finds unsettling, I wonder, Minister?
Not at all. And I think I do remember Keir Starmer making some quite complimentary comments about Margaret Thatcher in a previous speech, which didn't actually go down all that well with some other people who remember her legacy very badly. So look, she was a successful Prime Minister in the sense that she got re-elected many times, but I would argue, and I'm sure many would argue, that she did a great deal of damage to this country in some of the policies that she put forward. But her portrait and her legacy lives on in Downing Street and lives on throughout our country.
All right. Lucy Powell, thank you so much for your time.